So what is anaerobic respiration? Anaerobic respiration is the production or synthesis of ATP in the absence of oxygen. So when oxygen is So what is anaerobic respiration? Anaerobic respiration is the synthesis of ATP in the absence of oxygen. So when oxygen is not available, then anaerobic respiration happens. So why does anaerobic respiration happens? Because we don't have oxygen. And what this does is that oxygen would act. So what is anaerobic respiration? Anaerobic respiration is the synthesis of ATP in the absence of oxygen. So when oxygen is not present, anaerobic respiration would happen. Why would this happen? Because oxygen is a hydrogen proton or electron acceptor. So oxygen would usually combine with 4 protons, 4 electrons to make 2 molecules of water. So oxygen acts as the final electron and hydrogen acceptor. But since you don't have oxygen, you won't make the final. So what is anaerobic respiration? It is the synthesis of ATP in the absence of oxygen. So when oxygen isn't available, because oxygen acts as the proton and electron acceptor at the end of oxidative phosphorylation, the oxygen molecule would accept protons and electrons and make water. So because there is no oxygen, there would not be any final and higher electron and hydrogen acceptors. So the hydrogen from the reduced NAD and FAD can't be removed. So the reduced NADH, right, would not become NAD and hydrogen. So no hydrogen would be released because there is no oxygen to accept the proton acceptor. So what is anaerobic respiration? It is the synthesis of ATP in the absence of oxygen. So when we don't have oxygen, then anaerobic respiration will take place. Why is that? Because oxygen, at the end of oxidative phosphorylation, oxygen accepts 4 protons and 4 electrons and make 2 molecules of water. But since you don't have oxygen, there would be no final electron and hydrogen acceptor. So oxygen cannot accept any hydrogen and electrons because you don't have oxygen. So the hydrogen from reduced NAD and FAD cannot be removed. So when NADH becomes NAD and a hydrogen is released, this process cannot happen because you don't have any oxygen to accept the protons that is released from this hydrogen. So since there is no electron and hydrogen acceptor, electron transmission chain stops working because you don't have any flow of electrons because reduced NAD is not releasing any hydrogens and hydrogens are not releasing any electrons and protons. So NAD and FAD are not regenerated. Since this reaction doesn't take place in anaerobic respiration, NAD would not be regenerated. However, glycolysis will still take place and you'll get net 2 ATP per glucose molecule. So anaerobic respiration is basically glycolysis taking place. And this is called substrate level phosphorylation. Oxidative phosphorylation is where oxygen is needed. Substrate level phosphorylation, you don't need oxygen. So oxygen is no longer needed here. And in glycolysis, you make 2 NADH, and there is a special pathway through which NAD can be regenerated. So what is that? Now in the yeast or plant tissue, it's called the ethanol pathway. And in animals, mammals or bacteria, it's the lactate pathway. And this is especially happening in muscles because muscles are lacking oxygen. So since muscles don't have oxygen, they go through anaerobic respiration a lot. Now, let's start with the plant pathway or the ethanol pathway. In plants or yeast, the pyruvate that is produced from the glycolysis will become ethanol, and ethanol would then become ethanol. This reaction right here is irreversible. So glycolysis makes two molecules of pyruvate through glucose, and you get 2 ATP in the process, and you also get 2 NADH. Now, this pyruvate will undergo decarboxylation. So glucose becomes pyruvate, and these two pyruvate molecules will become ethanol when it undergoes decarboxylation. You produce CO2, and this ethanol would then accept hydrogen. So ethanol acts as a hydrogen acceptor. So ethanol accepts hydrogen and becomes ethanol. So ethanol becomes ethanol in the presence of alcohol dehydrogenase. So this enzyme would help ethanol become ethanol, and this prevents protons from lowering pH in yeast because hydrogen would accept, because ethanol accepts hydrogen and becomes ethanol. This prevents yeast from getting their pH lowered because of protons. So NAD is regenerated in this process, and this allows glycolysis to continue. And in the process, again, you make net 2 ATP. But ethanol is toxic, right? Ethanol is toxic. And since this reaction is irreversible, there is a lot of chemical potential energy that is wasted in the process. Now comes the lactate pathway, or the pathway that happens in mammals, humans, and bacteria. So this process where glycolysis produces pyruvate, and pyruvate will become lactate, and this is reversible. So this reaction is reversible. Now glycolysis, as usual, would produce pyruvate and also make 2 ATP in the process, net gain of 2 ATP, and 2 NADH would also be formed. But pyruvate would accept the hydrogen. So pyruvate would directly accept the hydrogen. It would act as a hydrogen acceptor. So it receives a hydrogen from the reduced NAD, and pyruvate becomes lactate or lactic acid. So pyruvate would gain hydrogen and become lactate or lactic acid. And this is catalyzed by lactate dehydrogenase. In the ethanol pathway, you were using alcohol dehydrogenase, right? Alcohol dehydrogenase. But in the lactate pathway, you are using lactate dehydrogenase. In the process, NAD is again regenerated because NADH would give the hydrogen to pyruvate, and NAD would be produced in the process. Now, again, like ethanol, lactate or lactic acid is toxic. So it can cause a drop in pH because it's acidic. Lactic acid is an acid, so it will cause a drop in pH. But this reaction is reversible. So the lactate that is produced in the cytoplasm would be transferred to the blood plasma. And this blood plasma from the muscles, it's usually the muscles that make lactate or lactic acid because muscles undergo anaerobic respiration a lot. So lactate is transferred to the blood plasma, and this blood plasma would take the lactate to the liver, and it would be broken down in the liver. What happens in the liver? Lactate is converted back to pyruvate by lactate dehydrogenase. And when oxygen is present, when the body gains oxygen, pyruvate is further broken down in the link reaction, and then oxidative phosphorylation happens. So what are the similarities and differences between the ethanol and the lactate pathway? Both happen because oxygen is low in concentration. So when we have a lack of oxygen, then ethanol and lactate pathway will happen. Both happens in the cytoplasm. Both involves glycolysis, and both will produce net 2 ATP for glucose.